I've unearthed a story that's sure to make your head spin right off your shoulders. It's about a couple, Burt and Haley, who find a house to die for. They think they're getting a killer deal on a fixer-upper, but they soon discover the only thing this house wants to fix is them permanently. They were hoping to get ahead in life, but the house has other plans for their anatomy. So settle into your coffins, kiddies, and try not to lose your heads. This is a nasty little number I call It Rolls Down the Stairs.
The house was a lie, but not the kind you tell yourself when you're young and stupid with love. This was an old lie, a deep one, the kind that settles in your bones and makes you sick from the inside out. Burt and Haley were neither young nor stupid with love anymore. Love, for them, had become a shared hospital room, the sterile quiet, broken by the rhythmic beep of machines that were, in the end, just measuring the departure of a life that had never really began. They were fleeing the wreckage, that's the truth of it. Not the cramped city apartment the realtor's brochure probably mentioned, but the ghost that lived there with them. The ghost of a crushed car door. The ghost of a steering wheel, slick with something other than rain. The ghost of a tiny, unformed body, lost in a storm of shattered glass and Bert's whiskey-soaked breath. The accident had happened a year ago, but for Haley, it was always happening right now. For Burt, it was a memory he tried to beat to death with a hammer every day. His guilt was a physical thing, a tumor behind his eyes that he masked with a brittle, aggressive pragmatism. He was the man with the plan, the fixer, the one who would drag them out of the pit he had dug. Haley, she was just adrift, a wraith in her own life, haunted by a phantom limb where her belly had been round. Their marriage wasn't a partnership, it was a trauma bond. Two drowning people clinging to the same piece of wreckage, mistaking the frantic grip of survival for an embrace. So they came to Greystone Manor, a sagging Victorian carbuncle on the forgotten ass end of Maine. Bought with the last of the settlement money that felt like blood money every time Haley looked at the checkbook. The town of Blackwood was one of those places that time hadn't so much forgotten as actively shunned. The houses looked tired, the people even more so. Greystone Manor wasn't a grand old lady. It was a patient in the final stages of a terminal illness. The paint peeled like sunburnt skin after a fever, revealing a gray, unhealthy wood beneath. The foundation groaned with the sound of old, arthritic bones. And the smell, oh, the smell. It was the first thing that hit you when the brittle-grinned realtor opened the door. A faint, sweetish odor of decay, like flowers left too long in a sick room, mingled with the damp, earthy breath of a cellar that had never known the sun. The house was a living pathology, and it had found its perfect hosts. Good bones, Burt had declared, his voice too loud in the echoing foyer. It was his mantra, his shield. Good bones. He was talking about the house, but he was trying to convince himself about them. Haley didn't say anything. She just ran a hand along the grand sweeping staircase that dominated the entrance hall. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, and felt slick to the touch, as if coated in a fine, invisible grease. She looked up into the gloom of the second-floor landing and felt a wave of vertigo so intense she had to grab the newel post to steady herself. The post was carved into the shape of a scowling, vaguely human face, its wooden eyes seeming to follow her. The house chose them. Haley knew it, deep down in the hollow place where her child should have been. It wasn't a salvation, it was a symptom, and the sickness was just getting started. Their first few weeks were a frantic, desperate performance of normalcy. Burt attacked the house with a kind of fury, his hammer blows echoing like gunshots through the cavernous rooms. He was a man at war, not with dry rot and peeling wallpaper, but with the silence in his own head. Every nail he drove was an argument he couldn't win. Every board he sawed a memory he was trying to dismember. Haley painted. She slathered walls with bright, false colors, sunny yellows and robin's egg blues, trying to cover the water stains that looked like weeping sores, trying to bury the house's history and her own under a thin membrane of latex. They were playing house, two broken children in a derelict dollhouse, their forced laughter sounding thin and brittle against the constant low groaning of the manor. Things started small, as it always does. It was a kindness at first, a terrible wounding kindness. "Did you hear that?" Haley would ask, her voice small after a floorboard creaked upstairs in an empty room. "Just the house settling, honey," Burt would say, not looking up from his work. "Old houses do that, you know." When she found a window she'd latched shut that morning standing wide open, its grimy pane letting in the cold, damp air, he put his arm around her. "You're just exhausted. You probably thought you locked it. We've been working too hard." He was so reasonable, so calm. It made her feel crazy. He needed her to be the crazy one. If she was the one who was unstable, forgetful, letting her imagination run away with her, then he could remain the rock, the protector, the man who was fixing everything, including her. But the house seemed to be listening. It seemed to be helping him. One afternoon, Haley was in the kitchen staring at a cabinet door that was hanging slightly ajar. She knew she had closed it. She was obsessive about it now. A quiet ritual of checking and rechecking. She closed it, pushed it firmly until she heard the click. She turned her back to get a glass of water, and when she turned around again, it was open. A sly inch of darkness. "Burt!" she called, her voice trembling. He came in, wiping sawdust on his jeans, his face a mask of weary patience. "What is it now, Hale?" "The cabinet, it keeps opening," he sighed, a long-suffering sound. He walked over, slammed the cabinet shut with unnecessary force. "The latch is loose. The floor's not level. It's an old house. For Pete's sake, I'll fix it tomorrow." He looked at her, and his eyes were full of pity that felt like an accusation. "You're letting this place get to you." He left. Haley stood there, her heart hammering. She stared at the cabinet, willing it to stay shut, and it did, all day. But later that night, as they were heading up to bed, Burt paused on the stairs. "See? Told you it was nothing. Cabinet's shut tight." He was right. It was. The house had made him right. It was a subtle shift, a quiet conspiracy between her husband and the rotten timbers of their new home. The house was validating his dismissals, co-opting his gaslighting, and turning a human failing into a supernatural weapon. It was isolating her, cutting her off from the one person she was supposed to trust, leaving her alone in the encroaching dark. The house wasn't just haunted, it was an active participant in her abuse. It was teaching Burt new ways to hurt her, and he was a very willing student. The lie of their new life, the one they were trying to build out of spackle and cheap paint, finally shattered on the first Tuesday of their 4th week. It was exactly midnight. Burt was a heavy sleeper, his snores a thick, rumbling counterpoint to the house's nocturnal groans. But Haley was not. She lay awake, listening, as she did every night. The silence in Greystone Manor was never empty. It was a waiting silence, a hell breath, and then it came. Crack! The sound was nothing like a branch snapping or a board breaking. It was organic, visceral. It was the sound of a large animal's spine breaking over a rock, a wet snap that vibrated up through the floorboards and into the hollow of her teeth. It was the sound of profound violation, final and irrevocable. Burt stirred, a thick grunt tearing from his throat. "What's that? Did you hear that?" Haley whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "How settling," he mumbled, the words already slurring as he slid back into his depths of sleep. His denial was automatic now, a reflex as ingrained as breathing. But Haley knew, oh she knew, that wasn't the house settling. That was the sound of something breaking that was never meant to be broken. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence after the axe falls, before the head hits the basket. And then the tumbling began. Thump. A soft, heavy sound from the top of the grand staircase. Not the clean, hard sound of a book or a box. This was a dense, lopsided sound. Something heavy and not quite round. Thump. Scrape. Thump. It was rolling. A sickening, ponderous avalanche of soft tissue and hard bone colliding with the unforgiving oak of the stairs. With each impact, Haley could almost feel it. The wet slap of long hair against the wood. The dull scrape of a chin against a riser. The final awful thwump as it came to rest on the welcome mat in the foyer. A sound like a melon packed with wet meat hitting the linoleum floor. And with the sound came the smell. The faint, sweet odor of decay that always lingered in the house was suddenly overpowering, thick and cloying. It was the smell of a freshly opened grave of rot and damp earth. But mixed in was the sharp, coppery tang of old blood and something else. Something wild and ancient. A scent of greed and insatiable hunger, of a thing that was always starving. Then came the whispers, not just a faint hiss on the edge of hearing. They were in her head, intimate and cruel, twisting the knife of her own private hell.
Should have been you.
A dry, sibilant voice scratched inside her skull.
He was drunk. Always drunk.
Burt, beside her, let out a soft snore. He heard nothing, saw nothing. He was safe in his cocoon of denial. Haley didn't sleep. At dawn, she crept to the top of the stairs, her body trembling so violently she had to hold the wall for support. The foyer was empty. The welcome mat was undisturbed. The morning sun, filtered through the stained glass window over the door, painted jewels of colored light on the polished floor. There was no sign of anything, nothing but the lingering foul smell that she could no longer pretend was just old house must. The ritual repeated itself every night at midnight. Crack! The wet tumbling, the smell of rot and blood, and a new whisper, tailored just for them, a new barb to pierce their fragile peace. One night, as the thing rolled, the whisper was for Burt, a faint hiss that just barely broke through his sleep.
Drunkard's hands can't hold on to anything.
He thrashed in his sleep, crying out a name.
Leo.
The name they had chosen for their son. Haley's mental state began to fray, the edges unraveling thread by thread. She pleaded with Burt, her voice raw with terror and lack of sleep. "It's happening, Burt. You have to hear it. It's talking to us." His denial became more aggressive, a frantic defense against the truth that was clawing at the doors of his perception. "There's nothing there, Haley. It's the pipes. It's the wind. It's this house falling apart around our ears." He started fixing things with a violent intensity. He nailed a loose board in the attic with a dozen nails, hammered until the wood splintered. He tore out a section of wall to check the plumbing, his face grim, finding nothing. Each repair was a declaration. "The problem is the house, not me. The problem is physical, not supernatural. The problem is not my fault." Their conflict became the house's lifeblood. It seemed to thrive on their arguments, to grow stronger with their fear and recriminations. After a particularly vicious fight, where Haley had screamed the word killer at him for the first time, the house that night was louder, the tumbling more violent. The whispers were a chorus. The house was feeding on them. They were trapped not just within its walls, but in a feedback loop of their own making, a horrifying trinity of trauma, terror, and a house that was learning to hate them with a terrifying intimacy. The breaking point came a week later. Haley couldn't take the not knowing anymore. The waiting was a torture worse than the event itself. As midnight approached, she crept out of bed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't go down the stairs. Instead, she huddled at the top, peering through the carved balusters of the railing, her body coiled like a spring. 11:59. The grandfather clock in the dining room began its wheezing, death rattle chime. 12 o'clock. Crack! It was directly overhead. So loud, so close, she felt the vibration in her bones. A fine shower of plaster dust drifted down from the attic hutch. Thump! It was at the top step of the landing, just a few feet away. She had her eyes squeezed shut. Please be a book. Please be a dead squirrel. Please be anything else. The whisper started immediately. No longer a faint hiss, but a clear, venomous thought injected directly into her mind.
I see you hiding, little mouse.
She couldn't stop herself. She had to look. She peeled one eye open, a sliver of vision through the wooden spindles. It was a head, a human head, tumbling end over end in a slow, almost lazy arc. But it was not just a head. It was a thing of pure body horror, a grotesque artifact from a nightmare sculpted in the darkest of imaginations. The flesh was pallid, waxy white, like a root vegetable that had never seen the sun, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, sickening inner light. Patches of what looked like black fungal growth marred one cheek, a lichen of the grave. The long dark hair was matted with not just blood, but a strange semi-gelatinous slime that left glistening trails on the oak steps. One eye was squeezed shut, the wrinkles around it deep and ancient. The other was wide open, and it was not a human eye. It was a perfect, flat, black disc, a circle of absolute void, reflecting nothing, absorbing all light, all hope. It was an eye that looked out on a cold, indifferent cosmos. An eye that had witnessed the heat death of stars and the screaming birth of galaxies. There was no malice in it, no anger, no pain. There was something far, far worse, the utter soul-crushing certainty of her own insignificance. As it tumbled past her hiding place, that black, galactic eye swiveled in its socket and locked with hers. A jolt of pure, undiluted terror shot through Haley, a current that burned out every circuit in her brain. It wasn't the fear of a ghost. It was the existential dread of an ant, realizing the boot hanging over it is attached to a being that doesn't even know it's there. It was the madness that comes from forbidden knowledge, from a single horrifying glimpse of the true, awful shape of reality. Thud, 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 thwomp. It landed on the welcome mat, the black eye staring blankly at the front door. It lay there, a piece of impossible, alien butchery, until the first hint of dawn touched the windows. Then, it didn't vanish, it dissolved. It became translucent like a jellyfish in the sun, until nothing was left but a damp spot on the mat and the lingering, coppery, sweet smell of rot. Haley stumbled back to the bedroom, her mind a scorched wasteland. She shook Burt awake, her hands like claws on his shoulders. "I saw it," she whispered, her voice the sound of grinding glass. "It's a head, Burt. It's a freaking head, and it's not human, not anymore. It saw me, it knew me." He stared at her, at the raw, unblinking terror in her eyes. And in that moment, Burt's carefully constructed wall of rationalism didn't just crumble, it was annihilated. He knew it was real. The next morning, they didn't talk. They just drove. They found themselves in the dusty, neglected archives of the town library, the air thick with the smell of decaying paper and forgotten stories. Burt's hands, usually so steady, trembled as he pulled down brittle, leather-bound ledgers. They didn't find a single neat story of a murder. They found something worse. They found a pattern, a disease, a history of an affliction documented in fragmented, terrified whispers across centuries. The first piece was from a Puritan magistrate's diary, dated 1692. The ink was faded, the script a spidery scrawl. October 12th, the good wife Pritchard was brought before us, accused of Congress with that which dwells in the soil of the unhallowed north pasture. She speaks of a hunger from the earth, a creeping blight that whispers promises in the dark of the moon. Her flesh is marked with a strange creeping mold. We did not hang her, for hanging is a mercy she does not deserve. The elders decreed the press. Let the stones teach her the gravity of her sins. Let the earth she worships claim her, bone by broken bone. The second was a thin volume of medical cases noted from a Dr. Alistair Finch, dated 1888. Patient Eleonora Greyblood, resident of the Greystone Manor, built upon the old Pritchard pasture, presents with what appears to be a profound melancholia, accompanied by severe somatic delusions. Claims her bones are cracking from within, that her flesh is loosening. Complains of a persistent auditory hallucination, a wet tumbling sound from the attic. There's a noticeable wasting of the flesh, a pallor that defies medical explanation. Her husband, the judge, grows impatient. October 31st, was called to the manor late this night. The judge claims Miss Greyblood suffered a fatal fall down the main staircase, yet the injury is peculiar. A clean severance of the head from the neck, as if by a butcher's cleaver. No other marks consistent with the fall. I will record the official cause of death as requested, but God help me, this was no accident. This was a harvest. The final piece was a carbon copy of a letter from a local folklorist to a colleague at Miskatonic University, dated 1932. And the locals still speak of the Greystone Blight. They call it a familial madness, but the stories are more specific. They say the house itself is a vessel, a womb, designed to ripen a certain fruit. They believe the land demands a tithe of flesh every few generations. It is a seed, and once it has ripened in the attic's dark, it must be planted anew. They say the house chooses its gardeners carefully, always finding those with the rot of their own to share. Burt pieced it all together, his face ashen. It wasn't a ghost replaying a memory. It was a cycle, a horrifying biological cycle, and they were the new gardeners. The knowledge didn't free them. It condemned them. They drove back to the house in a thick, suffocating silence, the fragmented documents on the seat between them like a death sentence. They were not fighting a ghost they could exorcise or a curse they could break. They were part of a process. They were ingredients in a recipe as old as the stones in the foundation. That night, they didn't huddle in their bedroom. They sat in the living room, a bottle of whiskey, Burt's first since the accident, between them. They were waiting for the end, but the house was done waiting. It was entering its final, active phase. The horror was no longer confined to the witching hour, no longer a subtle whisper. It was a full-throated scream. The architecture began to warp, started slowly. Haley glanced down the main hallway and it seemed to stretch. The door at the far end receded into an impossible distance. The corners of the room no longer seemed to be 90 degrees. They became acute, sharp, threatening to impel. The floral wallpaper began to writhe, the patterns twisting into leering, monstrous faces. The walls themselves began to pulse, to breathe, and they became slick with the same foul, glistening slime that had coated the head. The house was turning itself inside out, revealing its true, non-Euclidean autonomy. The air grew thick, heavy, and vibrated with a low subsonic hum that made their teeth ache. The smell of rot was now so overpowering it was a taste in the back of their throats, the taste of the grave. At midnight, there was no single crack. There was a deafening, splintering roar from the attic, as if the very roof of the house was being torn open to the cold, black, star-dusted sky. Thump! The head appeared at the top of the stairs, but it wasn't just tumbling this time. It was purposeful. It rolled down step by agonizing step, but it didn't stop at the bottom. It kept coming. It rolled off the welcome mat and onto the living room rug, its momentum unnatural, its single black eye fixed on Haley. Its mouth a lipless slit and the pale, doughy flesh was gaping open in a silent, birthing scream. This was not a replay. This was the culmination. Haley scrambled backwards, a thin, mewling sound escaping her lips. She looked at Burt, her eyes pleading. "Do something. Save me. Fix this." But Burt wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the head, and his face, once a mask of terror, was now eerily serene. His mind shattered by a year of relentless guilt, eroded by the house's psychological warfare, and finally broken by the awful cosmic knowledge of what this place was. He had not just snapped, he'd been remade. He had accepted the house's terrible logic. He saw the head, the fruit, and he saw Haley, the fallow ground, the vessel needed for the next planting. The house had whispered its final terrible truth to him. It offered him a penance, a way to fix what he had broken, a way to create a new life to replace the one he had destroyed. The entity wasn't a ghost seeking a lost love. It was an impersonal biological cycle, a grotesque parody of life, death, and of parenthood. This story began with Burt's actions leading to the death of their child. It would end with his actions leading to the birth of a new horror. He stood up. He walked towards Haley, his movements calm, measured. "Burt?" she whispered. "Burt, what are you doing?" He looked down at her, and the man she had married was gone. In his eyes was the same vast, empty, cosmic indifference she had seen in the creature's black disc eye. He had become the house's new caretaker, its priest, its husband. He knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he took her arms. The head rolled to a stop at her feet, its silent scream of promise. The ultimate horror wasn't the monster from the attic, it was the monster beside her, the one who had sworn to protect her. "It's okay, Hell," Burt whispered, his voice full of a terrible, loving madness. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of whiskey and the grave. "This time, I'll do it right. This time, we'll make something that lives forever. And as his hands moved from her arms to her neck, Haley's world dissolved into a final, piercing understanding. The sound she was about to hear would not be the house settling. It would be the sound of the next crack. And this time, she would be the source. The cycle would continue. The house would be fed. And in the dark, sick heart of Greystone Manor, something new was about to be born.
Well, now, that's what I call a hostile takeover. It seems Burt finally got ahead in his new role as the manor's caretaker. Poor Haley wanted a partner to build a life with, and instead, she got one who wants to build a new life out of her. Talk about a marriage that came apart at the neck. It just goes to show you, my fiendish friends, the most terrifying monster isn't always the one rolling down the stairs. Sometimes it's the one who promised to love, honor, and obey. So the moral of tonight's tale is simple. If your new home comes with its own nightly percussion solo, and your spouse starts whispering sweet nothings to the stains on the ceiling, it might be time to move, or at the very least, stop sleeping in the same room. Until next time, keep your doors locked and your sanity optional. This is your Tombkeeper returning to the rot. Pleasant screams.
Tales from the tomb.